Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for waiting. I believe our guest was held up by a French person. Welcome to the 79th meeting of the Mile End Group. My name is John Rentoul. I'm a columnist on the Independent on Sunday and have called myself a slavish admirer of Tony Blair, which is why I think I was asked to do this job. But first, I just want to say thank you very much to the sponsors of the Mile End Group, Hewlett Packard, who sponsored the group for 8 years. And this Mile End Group is in partnership with the Queen Mary School of Economics and Finance, so we thank them as well. I teach a course here with John Davis, who is over there, Peter Hennessy's emissary, from the very elevated heights of contemporary history in Britain. We teach a class called New Labour in Government, which takes history up to 21 months ago, which I think is very exciting, and we enjoy it hugely. With me is Bill Keegan, who writes for The Observer. I recently ran a Twitter campaign called Keep Keegan Weekly, this goes directly to my judgment, skill, and power of persuasion. Failed, and he is now fortnightly, but also appears in Don't All Boo at Once in the Daily Mail, which I thought was the best response to the Observer's poor judgment in decreasing the frequency. We're also joined by Professor Peter Hennessy, who will need no introduction to any of you. I've just introduced him as descending from the Olympian heights, the acting professor of something or other. Contemporary British history. I do apologise. And of course, Ed Balls, again needs no introduction, but he's going to get one anyway, which is what Bill Keegan is here for.
Thank you, John. I'll buy you a drink later, that was very kind. A few years ago, there was a huge meeting at the City University. 400 people were expecting to see a certain speaker. And Hugh Stevenson, the Professor of Journalism, stood up and he said, tonight's speaker needs no introduction because he hasn't turned up. Anyway, my understanding is it wasn't GSK who was detaining Ed, but it was François Hollande. Right? If Merkel could intervene in that campaign, why can't we? I've known Ed for many years, since 1992, when he was the youngest leader writer on the Financial Times. And we met in true Fleet Street tradition at Alvina for lunch. We got on very well, and we continued to have lunch, and followed his career with great admiration. And I'm delighted that he's come here during a pretty busy week. I'd like to begin by asking him a question. I've obviously admired his campaign.
Your powers.
Wow. I've admired his campaign the last 2 years of economic policy. I'd like to ask him how he sees this present recession by comparison with the 1930s, being a great student of history.
My gosh. Well, it's a great honour to be invited here to the 79th meeting of this group, which is amazing. And it's about being Shadow Chancellor. The thing about being a government minister is, one, you can get away with being late. And secondly, you tend not to be because you have some fancy cart of whiskey here. And if you're Shadow Chancellor, you've not really got a good excuse because you should have more time. And the tube took a long time coming down from Westminster. But it's a great honour to be here and to be with John and Peter, and also with Bill, who it's true we met in early in Alvino's. The moment I remember, I first read Bill Keegan's column, in my view, in the Observer, and he was a business editor in 1979 and 1980, when he was writing about the Thatcher economic experiment. And it was a great honour for me, 20 years later, to be asked to write his summer column, because Bill hands over his column for 4 weeks in August. And so I was offered a slot in August to write his column. And I thought the thing I should do is go back and read the columns Bill Keegan wrote in 1979 and 1980, so that I can reflect them in our contemporary debates. And I went back to the Observer and went through all of the old columns from the Observer from 1979 and found Bill Keegan's columns, including his summer columns. And then he didn't hand his column over to guest columnists. He wrote them from Provence. And so the column, there's a picture of Bill, who actually looks almost exactly the same as now, but his moustache was slightly bigger. And
why you agree?
Yeah, in my, which was called Bill Keegan, The View from Provence. Anyway, I would say the thing which is distinctive about where we are in the economy at the moment in Britain and around the world, and the reason why the right parallel is the 1930s, is not because it's not simply a deep recession in Britain and in the US, because we've had those before. We had those in 79 and 1980. It's not even a recessions after a financial crisis, because we had those in the world in 1975, and the G7 was first born as the G5 to sort out the world economy with real leadership. The Bonn Summit in, I think, 1976, the locomotive of the European and world economy to be Germany at that time, much to the Germans' frustration. The thing which is distinctive about this downturn is, one, is after a huge financial crash, which clearly 1929 is a parallel. Secondly, it's affected Europe and America. But thirdly, I think it's distinguished by crises not just of economics, but of politics. And politics and leadership. And I think you've had three different crises, all happening at the same time. It's governments in each continent not being able to face up to what needs to be done, which makes things so worrying. In America, you've had a very standard American crisis. 18 months before a presidential election, a president being opposed by Congress who have a different view of what needs to be done, the deadlock of last summer, the downgrading, the real worries in the world economy last August about the US economy. I think the good thing you can say is that this is probably resolving itself in favour of the president and stimulus, and unemployment's now falling. The downside is, a bit like in America in the world in the 30s, there has not been a strong American leadership voice on economic matters in the last 2 years, because the president's been very inwardly focused. The second thing is you have a very unusual crisis in Europe, the Eurozone crisis, which is also essentially a failure of political leadership, a failure of leaders to be able to face up to what needs collectively to be done, and to turning in and thinking about what needs to be done to satisfy domestic political constituencies. And that's why we have, a failure to agree, austerity piled upon austerity. And here in Britain, we have a crisis and a coalition. And of course, the last time we had a coalition of this importance in Britain was 1931, when Ramsay MacDonald took the parts of the Labour leadership into coalition with the Conservatives. And the crisis here in Britain is quite different from America and Europe, because I think probably the crisis was a hung parliament after a general election in which there was which we had a large deficit and a real worry about whether things could be sorted out. In my constituency, we went canvassing the weekend after the general election, thinking that we may well be facing another general election in a few weeks, a few months' time. And there was a real fear, I think, that would weak government not be able to rise to the economic challenge. Out of that crisis, a coalition was born, a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. And people, I think, sighed a sigh of relief that there was, I didn't, but there was a sigh of relief. A government's been formed in the national interest to make the important decisions which need to be done. And, with the CBI and the Institute of Directors and many newspapers rallying round, as happened in 1931. But the problem was, the coalition reached an agreement, but it was the wrong agreement. They've been stuck on the wrong path on the pace of deficit reduction and the way that's crushed growth and pushed unemployment up. And the thing you learn about coalitions, and we've learned in our history, is once a coalition has reached a view and a way forward, coalitions find it very hard to change course. Very, very hard. So I would say the reason why the 30s parallel is right is after a financial crisis, governments turning in on themselves, pursuing austerity even when it's not working, no collective plan for jobs and growth, America turning inwards, Europe unable to face up to the need for collective action, and here in Britain, a coalition making the wrong decisions. And it's that 30s parallel that I think is particularly interesting.
I think in the first conversation we had, me being a no and you not being actually, is about Labour and Whitehall. You were interested in Labour's historic desire to mitigate, if not break, the power of the Treasury. We talked about the Department of Economic Affairs 64, 69, whether it had lessons for you. And I remember John Smith giving me an interview in 1993, leader of the Labour Party, saying how he wanted to build up the Department of Trade and Industry as a ministry of production to not take over from the Treasury, but to be a counterweight, to be the voice of production rather than retrenchment. And you were very interesting, at least I remember you being very interested by all that, and thinking about how it might be done by Labour. Now, if you get back into office, and you're Chancellor, Prime Minister, let's just
Chancellor's,
well, that's
safer.
I'll give you Chancellor. No, I'll give you Chancellor. Do you think there's mileage in thinking about redoing the middle of Whitehall? The Treasury is too powerful in good times and in bad. And if so, how would you build in that Labour's appetite for production, which I think you call it, into the machinery of government and change the balance of power amongst the economic departments?
Well, the problem of 1929, 1930 and 31 was that the Treasury view prevailed. And the Treasury view captured a Labour Chancellor and Prime Minister Snowden and O'Donnell, who, let's be honest, wanted to be captured, and took us back to a view of the world which said the faster you cut spending, the better it will be for growth and jobs, which turned out to be incorrect. And I think that the thing which worries me at the moment is we're sort of seeing a return of that Treasury view in the manifestation of the coalition. And at that time, Labour was captured by the Treasury. I think, to be quite honest, Snowden and O'Donnell were kind of totally willingly captured. They said, take us over. So therefore, it wasn't like it was an ambush. Then the 64 to 70 government was an attempt to replace or kind of to put the levers of power and leadership on the wider real economy in the hands of another department of Economic Affairs, and that didn't work.
Why don't you think it worked?
Because I think that that in politics and government, influence comes from having levers and resource, and that is controlled by the Treasury, and rightly, because the Treasury's got to control public spending and grip the public finances. You have to have discipline, but the discipline and the ability to use tax and spending as levers in a disciplined way, which the Treasury will never ever relinquish, and I don't think you can function without a strong Treasury. That ends up making it hard for any department which is in opposition to the Treasury, which is like the Department of Economic Affairs. Whereas I think 45 to 50, the Treasury, with Dalton and then Cripps, were working with the grain of what the government was trying to do. And our view in 1997 was that rather than trying to undercut or circumvent the Treasury, what you had to do is make the Treasury a department of sound public finances and growth, jobs and social justice.
Do you think you succeeded?
Well, the trouble with life is that it's never easy to make anything perfect. In the year up to 1997, one of the things I discussed in detail with Terry Burns when he was permanent secretary, and then we did a speech out, you could put the speech in Manchester, even for the election, was the wider role of the Treasury. And we actually, it seemed arcane, but we rewrote the objectives of the Treasury. And we said an objective of the Treasury was, it wasn't simply about sound public finances, although that was important, it was also about getting back to full employment, the 1944 White Paper aims, reducing child poverty. I think that the criticism that George Osborne likes to make of our Treasury was that, and I think he's wrong about this, but his criticism would be, we spent too much time worrying about jobs and welfare to work and tackling child poverty and reforming the health service and trying to have a tough competition policy, and not enough time engaged upon the macro economy. That's what he would argue. But obviously, partly, the decision to make the Bank of England independent. The decision to make the Bank of England independent did two different things. On the one hand, three different things. First of all, it stopped the Treasury being the decision maker on interest rates. Secondly, it removed, hugely importantly, the debilitating monthly argument and wrangle between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor over who set the interest rates, which was a disaster for Thatcher Lawson, disaster for Major Lamont, and very difficult for Major K. Clark. The third thing it did, it actually increased the power of the Treasury. It allowed the Treasury to say, well, I see you want to make that decision, and Prime Minister, and I can see why you might want to do that, but I'm not sure the independent Bank of England will wear it.
So it was an anti-Tony device, was it?
No, it was a way it's a bit more subtle than that.
Much though, much more subtle.
I mean, it allowed people, it allowed those people who said we should set the minimum wage at a higher level, and we don't believe that will cost jobs. You could say, well, first of all, setting the minimum wage at too high a level will cost jobs. But in any case, if that's the judgment of the Bank of England, and they say that our minimum wage will push up wages and prices and lead to high interest rates was enough to focus the mind of any Prime Minister higher mortgage rates. And so it actually did allow the Treasury to be, it was in some ways a new lever in the Treasury's influence. Now, what we, this will provoke a sort of, humour, but when the Labour Treasury was working well and effectively in partnership with other government departments. And actually, the times when we succeeded with DTI was on radical reforms of competition policy, with John Prescott's department on a reshaping of the institutions of regional policy, actually with Alan Milburn on the introduction of a purchase and provider split in the health service, the strengthening of PCTs, which came from the Treasury, really. Building Schools for the Future, which was a partnership between David Miliband, the Schools Minister, and us at the Treasury. And that was the Treasury, and very much on the whole introduction of, first of all, welfare to work in the New Deal, with a windfall tax, and then tax credits to make work pay. Those were all Treasury-driven policies about growth, jobs and tackling poverty, which would not be seen as the function of a traditional and narrow Treasury, and which historically the Treasury had been very good at stopping. And I think actually for that 10 years, if you wanted, the most exciting jobs to do in the Treasury were to go and work on these wider issues of economic and social policy.
So you run this model again if you've got power, you return this back?
I think the problem, if you take the debate at the moment about jobs and growth, David Cameron is banging the table saying we need a jobs and growth plan. And he's looking to the Treasury to deliver the jobs and growth plan. And unless the Treasury engages in the jobs and growth plan, it will just not be possible for the biz department or any other department to deliver it. I think the problem is that we have a government at the moment run by 19th century liberals.
So it's just a question
who don't actually believe
a different mindset, but the same mechanics.
I think
that
I think it's been true for either 75, 150 or 1,000 years, depending upon your time perspective. And, you are a historian of contemporary history, but you probably take a 1,000-year view. In that last 1,000 years, if the Treasury didn't think it was a good idea, it was very hard for other government departments to, and even the other prime ministers of other government departments to force the Treasury's hand. And therefore you've got to make the Treasury believe in these wider objectives. I don't think there's an alternative to that. I'm absolutely not saying you reinvent the past, you do things in the same way. Of course you can learn lessons about what works and what doesn't, how to be effective, and in every area there's a different set of challenges. But I think the lesson of Labour history in the last 100 years is that unless Labour works with the Treasury and makes the Treasury a Labour Treasury, Labour doesn't achieve its goals in government.
Now, this point about the Independent Bank of England, I remember in opposition you were on a famous pamphlet of yours, the Fabian one, which you admitted to Gordon, which you'd written, which had a slightly different view about the ERM, single currency and all that. But you emphasised several times the need for governments to be constrained, and obviously the Independent Bank of England was one. But do you think in the end you were not constrained enough? And to what extent would you say the kind of accusations levelled at you by the opposition, by the government now, were justified? To what extent did things go wrong because of the international situation? To what extent was it mistakes that you made?
Well, I think the argument I made was for did a speech in '97 about this was an argument for constrained discretion. But what you actually need, that you cannot run macroeconomic policy, economic policy, interest rates or fiscal policy unless you are able to be flexible in the face of changing economic events, nationally and internationally. And as I said, part of what the coalition has done has imposed inflexibility on George Osborne. I think if George Osborne had a majority, he would have changed course, because he would have been able to do that. His problem is he can't change course without putting the Liberal Democrats in an impossible decision, and that's why this is a sort of a tragedy of coalition rigidity. And so the question was, how could you have flexibility in a way which is credible? And the constraint comes from the Independent Bank of England, the clarity of the inflation target, transparency in monetary policy making, the fiscal objectives, transparency in how they're reported, the role of independent auditing, and what, in a sense, what the Office of Budget Responsibility does is add to independence, the Bank of England independence in statistics, in adding to the constraints around your discretion. Now, the real question, the question you ask is, I don't think that our problem was we didn't get the constraints right. I don't think there is any evidence, publicly or privately, for example, there was any fiddling of economic forecasts, public finance or economic, certainly not at any time that I was in the Treasury. I don't think it was that the Bank of England's independence was being undermined. I don't think it was that the fiscal rules weren't tough enough. I think that the problem was there was a failure of economic policy makers across British economics, the Bank of England, the financial regulator and the Treasury, which was a similar failure across the Treasury and the SEC and the Fed in the US and France, Germany, to see the seeds of the financial crisis. And in that sense, it was a global intellectual failure made across countries. It was made across countries which didn't have independent Bank of Englands, did or didn't have statutory regulators, had Twin Peaks financial regulation models, and the Bank of England in charge. So in the fundamental issue about the 2007 crisis, it was a British failure, as it was an American, a French, a German failure. That isn't to say that there weren't things which we got wrong at all, and that isn't to say that there weren't things which that we got wrong as British policymakers in a British context, which weren't replicated in other countries. But the fundamental failure was a global intellectual failure of which we were part.
Your mentioned forecasters reminds me, we had Dennis Healy was there last year, and he used to say that he'd like to do to economic forecasters what the Boston Strangle did for door-to-door salesmen.
I think when we came to government in 1997, we dropped having the point forecast and moved to ranges, precisely because the spurious accuracy was a mistake of economic forecasting. The interesting thing was, though, the first time we really came under pressure on the economic forecast was the autumn of 1998. It was after the closing of a big semiconductor plant in Tony Blair's constituency, which John will, I'm sure, remember. It was after the Russian default of August 98. You had the Thailand issues earlier in the year. You had the LTCM, the big hedge fund crisis in New York in September. Big sense of crisis. And our judgment, and as I said, this was a collective judgment of all of us at the Treasury, and me, Gus, the whole team, was growth would be about 0.75% in 1999. And the market consensus was naught. Goldman Sachs -0.5%. We're going to go into recession. And it was our worst year by far in all my time in the Treasury for forecasting. Because the actual outturn wasn't 3/4 or 0 or -5, it was 2.9, plus 2.9. You actually had incredibly strong growth the following year, partly because the Bank of England, one of the realities, going back to this point about flexibility, politicians making interest rate decisions led to inflexibility, because it was incredibly difficult to change interest rates. Because if you got it wrong, would be the right judgment, what was the Prime Minister's view, what happened to sterling. Once you had an independent Bank of England and a monetary policy, they were completely liberated from all these political pressures. And they cut interest rates something like 9 times consecutively over that 98 into 99. 9 times out of 13 months. If you'd had 9 consecutive interest rate cuts done by a Chancellor, people would halfway through or earlier have been saying they've lost control, sterling prices, hell in a handcart. Actually, the Bank of England was able to flexibly cut interest rates much harder, constrained by the inflation target. And that was an important contributor to that growth number coming in so much higher. What it also did, though, was that was one factor, and you can think of another 5, where people said, oh my God, a hedge fund crisis, a financial market crisis. The actual outturn was so much better. And it did lead, over that decade, to a complacency. That after 4 or 5 times when people feared the worst and actually things stabilised, Alan Greenspan, for one, was convinced that global financial markets have become stabilising, not destabilising.
Thank you very much. Now, we ought to have a chance for questions from the audience. So if you can stay in darkness if you like. But if we could have the lights up, and if you can... oh, we're going to be plunged into darkness, and you can be in light. If you could raise your hands if you want to ask a question. I always say to my students, our students, that when we have visiting guests of the Shadow Chancellor's calibre, make sure it's a question about being Shadow Chancellor that he hasn't answered before, which is a really stiff test. I should have said at the start, of course, that all this is on the record, because I failed to say that at the start. All the rude things he's just said about Ed Miliband are off the record. But anything he says from now on will be on the record. Sorry, that was a joke.
That was before we came.
Who would like to ask a question? Gentlemen in the...
Thanks very much. I understood you say that you thought that George...
Can you wait for the machine, David?
No, machine's just on its way.
Thanks very much. I understood you say that you thought George Osborne would like to change policies but was constrained from doing so by the Liberals. Could you elaborate? In what respect would George Osborne, what would he like to do, and what is it that stop him from doing?
He knows he's going to be judged by what happens to growth, employment and the deficit, fundamentally. And all those indicators have gone in the wrong direction for him. A year and a half ago, he was projecting strengthening growth, falling unemployment and borrowing coming down the track. He's now in a position where already he's had to say that there's been no growth really in the last year. The prospects for this year are pretty weak. Unemployment's rising, and borrowing is coming much, much higher than he expected. The austerity is going to last into the next Parliament. And I think if you actually look at the numbers, in 2011, the domestic economy contracted by 1%. Domestic demand fell by 1%. It was only the euro area which stopped there being an overall recession for Britain. That's the irony of where we are. And I think in those circumstances, a sensible and rational Conservative Chancellor would, while sticking to his deficit reduction plan, be recognising as that he has to calibrate the pace of his deficit reduction in order to try and keep the economy growing and unemployment falling, because as Standard & Poor's says, austerity becomes self-defeating. The problem is that when he signed up to the deal and massively accelerated the pace of deficit reduction, he required, or the deal said, Nick Clegg would say, I was against a VAT rise, but now I'm in favour, because it's necessary. Vince Cable, who had said, cutting faster will be damaging for jobs and growth, had to eat his words and say, I support this plan. It's actually the Liberal Democrats who have been the strongest in saying, this deficit reduction plan is the cornerstone of the coalition. And in those circumstances, if George Osborne has to say, well, I thought it was the right plan, but actually it's not working. I mean, where does that leave the Liberal Democrats? I mean, where's it, how do they explain the next election why they not only ditched their manifesto, but did so in a way which turned out to be, unsustainable? So I think it goes to the heart of whether the coalition is sustainable. If it wasn't for that, I think a sensible Conservative Chancellor would have found a way to slow the pace of deficit reduction while sticking to a sensible deficit reduction plan, supported by the Bank of England, supported by the international markets. I think that either George Osborne is just unbelievably doctrinaire, or the coalition makes life very difficult, and you can choose.
Question in the middle here. I'll allow one of our distinguished guests to add a footnote while the microphone's coming down. You want to add a footnote to the...
We ought to get into discussion at some stage. You mentioned the Eurozone, the future of Europe. I think some of your representatives of the anti-European, whereas I seem to recall you are not at all. You might get on that later.
Go on, let's have a question.
Ian Beasley from the My Lane Group. I'd like you to come on a little journey into the future, to May 2015, and Prime Minister Cooper has just appointed you Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's your first day, you've gone into Great George Street, gone to the Chancellor's office, I think on the second floor, and you sent for your permanent secretary, and you give him a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper there's a heading that says, the lessons of 2007 to 2010. But what else is written on the paper?
What else in the paper as well?
You haven't been asked that before.
Definitely not. I mean, I think your preamble is multiply implausible. The great thing about that comment, I think we'll actually make that a semicolon. You can absolutely move on. What would you? I think what is likely to be there. Of course, we don't know. It's 3 years away, and it may well say these are the elements of the Liberal Democrat manifesto, which we think they will want to stick to in the coalition discussion. And these are the ones that they are going to do complete U-turns on. It may say that. It may say these are the decisions you have to make about on fiscal policy to try and get the difficult decisions you have to make to get back on track the George Osborne deficit reduction plan, unless you want to move to, or how to move to your own plan. That might be under the heading clearing up George Osborne's economic mess. And then I think there will be some, there will definitely be a heading which says, these are your manifesto commitments, and here's the pre-work we've done to deliver each of them.
So no lessons from 2007-10?
No, you said as well as the lesson from 2007-10, what else would
No,
be?
I said as well as the heading, what else is on the paper?
Oh, I see. So no, but I'm sorry, I answered your question. I answered your question. As well as the lesson from 2007-10, what else is on the paper? And so did you want me to say what the lessons were? Oh, that's a completely different question. Oh my God, that's in that case, I have been asked that one before. So.
Okay, all right.
John, he's got to answer that. What's
No,
that?
he's answered that 100 times.
I'll have a go at it.
I'm really sorry.
I am a Constitution unit, an admirer of your wonderful lobby briefings at the back of the House of Commons gallery when Gordon Brown was bashing the shadow Chancellor over the head and you're all ignoring him. Look at the international scene for a moment. Everybody sort of knows that so much depends on growth in the American economy. Can you do a read across about the rate of growth and the nature of the growth in the American economy that would make a difference to us? And secondly, what about Europe? What are the chances of this fiscal pact actually holding, and what direct effect might it have, would it have on us? You must have done a lot of work on both of those.
Well, I think there is. I'm going to quick on the other one as well. There are wider lessons from what's happened in economies in the last 20 or 30 years, but in particular on the lessons of the crisis. And I think this is a lesson which George Osborne hasn't learned, is that in the end, it's not about the particular institutional structure you have for decision making in financial stability, but whether or not the key players are actually have got the information and are looking for where the real vulnerabilities lie. And George is going to change the whole architecture of financial regulation, and we can talk about this. I think it will make it more complicated and less clear. But fundamentally, there was a discussion happening in 2007, which started when I was a minister and then carried on. Should the Royal Bank of Scotland, how would the UK respond to the Royal Bank of Scotland's proposed takeover of ABN AMRO? And the only issue that was ever raised with me as the minister by the Financial Services Authority was, we must make sure that the regulation of the merged entity is regulated out of London, not out of Amsterdam, because we don't think the Amsterdam regulators are as good as us. Nobody from the FSA or the Bank of England ever said there is any issue in the balance sheet of Royal Bank of Scotland which makes this a risky proposition, nor did the non-executives of RBS. And I think that tells you that you have to, that shuffling the advisors or changing the structures doesn't make the difference. The issue is, are you actually looking for where the risks are? Are you doing so in an aggressive and invasive way? And the answer was that we weren't, and nobody was at that time. And we had statutory organisations do that job, and they didn't. Secondly, in terms of America, the interesting thing is that America had a downgrade for its credit rating agency in August, following which long-term interest rates in America have not risen, they've fallen. Growth hasn't fallen, it's accelerated, and unemployment hasn't risen, it's fallen. And that might tell you something about the American economy, and that might tell you something about the credit rating agencies. And you can make your own mind up. Personally, I think it's the latter. But the reality is that the pace of US fiscal consolidation is much steadier. There's been much more of a focus on trying to support the recovery through stimulus at this time, and it's working in a way that it's not working in the UK and across Europe. And I think the American example is instructive for us in the short term in terms of jobs and growth. I think in Europe, I am deeply doubtful, as is I think the whole of the rest of the observing in the market world, as to whether or not the Greek deal is sustainable. I don't think that is the most important challenge facing the Eurozone by any means. And I think that the likely outcome at the moment is we're going to face a long, multi-year, protracted period of negligible growth and rising unemployment. And I think that is very challenging for Europe and the world. and it will require leadership to change course on that. So I don't see where it's coming from at the moment. I was at an event yesterday at the American Embassy, the German Embassy actually, where an economist said to me, we in Germany over the last decade have had slow wage growth and tight budgets in order to improve our competitiveness. And if it works for us, why can't it work for the whole of the rest of the euro area? And the answer to that is, well, the scale of fiscal consolidation and the massive gain or the kind of recapturing of competitiveness across southern Europe is a massive, huge challenge. But of course, when Germany was going through that phase, the whole of the rest of Europe, the world, was growing strongly. And it's impossible for the rest of Europe to do that unless Germany and the northern economies of Europe pull their weight. And unless you have an engine for growth and dynamism in the euro area outside the southern countries needing a competitiveness adjustment, the only way to claw that competitiveness is by an incredibly painful and long drawn-out period of negligible growth and high employment. And that is a very, very risky prospect. And so I do think it really comes back to leadership amongst the richer countries in the Eurozone. And I think at the minute, I'm talking too long, but let me just say one other thing. In all the time when I was in government, we faced very difficult decisions in Europe. Who was going to be the head of the European Central Bank? Was it going to be Duisenberg? How we would deal with the savings tax issue. You would have very difficult meetings of the finance ministers in ECOFIN. And the finance ministers would come in, and it was their job to defend the national interest, protect the tax base, not be required to spend too much. But at a certain moment, the issue would be elevated to the level of the leaders who would say, I'm sorry, finance ministers, but in the collective European interest, we have put narrow national interests aside and forged a way forward which shows Europe can make decisions and lead. And the thing which has been distinguishing about the last 3 years is that the leaders have not been able to do that. And it's the leaders who've also been forced to kind of reflect a narrower national interest. You cannot make an intergovernmental single currency work if intergovernmentalism isn't functioning. And that is at the core of the euro problem, in my view. It comes down in the end to sort of politics and collective leadership. And the analogy is, if you have a bunch of countries who decide to go off-piste skiing, individuals go off-piste skiing, pretty dangerous. They're halfway down the slope, they're all tied together, and somebody falls down. There's no point in starting a debate at that point about why one of the skiers didn't spend more time doing fitness training for the last 3 years. And if you cut the ropes and lose one, and you cut them in the middle, you might lose another 2 or 3 skiers in the process. What you've got to do is pick the skier up, take a pause, set off down the mountain again, get to the bottom, and then have a discussion about how we make sure next time we go skiing, we do it in a safe and fit way. You don't do it when you're halfway down. And if national politics forces you to have that debate halfway down the slope, it's going to get dark.
I promised a question over here. Gentleman with his hand up. Who wants a question over here? Do you want to get a microphone over there as well? I was going to wind up at 1:45, but on the Burko principle, I think it's called.
Just keep going.
We're just going to keep going. A bit of extra time for Transport for London slow edges.
Thank you. You didn't answer this gentleman's question, so I'm going to ask you my question, which is fairly similar. So I run a business and we've just been appointed a new finance director. I see Chancellor being a parallel type of thing in industry. And one of the questions we asked internal candidates that have been in the business for some time is, what one decision would you have made differently in the last 12 months that would have had a better financial outcome for this business? So just referring back to, let's say, for example, that I was Gordon Brown and I won the election and was seeking who my chancellor would be. What would your answer to that question be?
About the period up to 2007, or the period after?
The period up to the last election.
2010.
What's the key thing that you would have you would have done differently? It's always very easy to look back with hindsight, obviously.
I think that I genuinely thought that as well as the 2007 lessons, there was the other things you were interested in, so I do apologise for that. During the period 2007 to 2010, I was the Education Secretary and wasn't really involved in the detailed nitty-gritty of the post-crisis decisions. Now, I stopped being a financial Treasury Minister in July 2007.
He did talk to you about this, didn't he, the Prime Minister?
Actually, very, very rarely on this.
Really?
Because to be quite honest, at my assistance, the thing was he had to decide who his Chancellor was. And once he decided who his Chancellor was, then his Chancellor had to do the job of the Prime Minister.
How did you
And the thing I said to you, the thing that I said to...
Sorry, I'm distracting from your answers.
No, it's just kind of my Alan. I said to Gordon Brown many times that I will not be the Alan Walters of this administration. I said it is impossible to have somebody who has spent 7 years in the Treasury and been the Chief Economic Advisor, who is appointed as the Education Secretary, second-guessing the Chancellor's Exchequer. And that is an absolute route to total instability, and I won't do it. And part of the times when I discussed the economy with the Prime Minister were almost always times when the Chancellor was there. Because my view was that I didn't say, we did have an argument about whether or not we should raise VAT or not, which I was against. But that was a discussion I had with Alistair, not outside the room. So I don't think you could, I think it was the history lesson tells you that just destroys an administration. So the truth was I had, I could count on the fingers of one hand the conversations I had with the Prime Minister about the economy in those 3 years. And if I'm honest with you, I think history will tell. And if you go around the world and talk about, and talk to finance ministers and central banks in other parts of the world, I think history will end up telling Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown did a phenomenal job in dealing with a massively difficult situation after the beginning of Northern Rock, the Northern Rock crisis. I think it was the way Northern Rock was handled, the way the RBS takeover was handled. At the margin, you can always debate, should they move more quickly on Northern Rock and move more quickly to public ownership? Was I think in the case of the Lloyds deal, there was no option at that point with HBOS, and that was absolutely Alistair's view. The Governor of the Bank of England has said today that he wished Alistair Darling had been a bit more aggressive in pushing the banks to lend to small business in 2009-10, and there's a lot of issues where at the margin, but the fundamental question, the nationalisation of the banks, the use of stimulus to prevent depression, in particular it was an amazing thing, unemployment, which rose every year from 81 to 84 certainly. Every other recession we've had, unemployment's kept rising for 3 or 4 years after the end of the recession. It actually started falling, almost coinciding with the end of the recession in the spring of 2009. So I actually, Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown deserve great credit for how they handled that, and I'm not really in a position to second guess any of it, because I wasn't a direct player, and my reading of it is that they made the right calls.
And especially the April 2009 G20. Amazing
achievement. And a leadership which was there. We actually involved George at the time, which hasn't been since. I think the much harder question for me is what decision, what would I do again between 2004 and 2007? Because actually, I was much more involved then, and that's a really hard question. And the reality was that the Bank of England and the Financial Services Authority and the Treasury met every month, looking at risks in the world economy and the British economy. And didn't see these risks. And so obviously I think to myself, why the hell didn't I challenge them more on those things? The interesting thing was, let me tell you, I was, as Treasury Minister, was worried about whether our system was robust to deal with the financial crisis, before the crisis. And I've been part of designing it, and I don't think it's fundamentally about architecture. So we decided we would play a war game, and governments do these kind of things, to test out systems. And we did so over a week in, I think, January or February 2007, before the crisis. And the scenario was which the Treasury invented. A Northern England building society gets into terrible trouble because a change in the European Court of Justice legal case completely undermines the worth and value of the land upon which a lot of its lending is securitized. That's manageable in and of itself, but one of our major clearers is substantially exposed to this Northern Building Society. And how do we deal with it? And it ended up with a 3.5-hour meeting between, I was the Treasury Minister, Mervyn King as Governor and Callum McCarthy as head of the FSA. It was a very tense meeting because there were quite different views about moral hazard and what the government's role should be and whether we should intervene. And we identified substantial barriers in state aids to bringing in a quick buyer from outside Britain. We identified that the deposit insurance system wasn't really fit for purpose. And then we decided on an 18-month work programme upon which the Treasury allocated one person, the Bank of England allocated one person, an 18-month work programme to sort out these issues, and 4 months later the crisis was raging. And I look back at that and think, if we were so prescient to work out such a brilliant war game, why ever weren't we realising this was actually a game which was about to unfold in front of us? But that's my biggest regret.
A question here.
Amy Watts, I'm an investment manager, but not mine here. As Shadow Chancellor, do you feel that there is a difficulty because, on the one hand, you'll feel that there's an easy win in saying to the government, if you'd followed our plans, things would be better. The I told you so argument. But the voters want to hear what you would do in the future, not what would have happened in the past.
I actually think the opposite. I think that and 2 points. One, I think in the end, if you're in politics, and especially if you're in the opposition, you have a duty to make the argument which you think is the right argument, and prosecute it to the best of your ability, and not worry, too much about whether, in any point in time, it is the easiest political argument or the hardest political argument. I mean, a year ago, it would have been I'd have had a much easier life in the last 12 months, the last 18 months, if I just said, well, we've got this coalition, the national interest, and, good luck to them. And we support them. But of course, that's exactly what Labour did in supporting the government joining the exchange rate mechanism in October 1990. And the country and Labour paid a very heavy price for that in mind. And I sort of learned a lesson that in the end, you've got to argue for what you believe in, and that's actually more important. And I wouldn't have any self-respect for me if I didn't make the argument I actually was the right argument. Doesn't mean you can't try and make it in a better way, or and try to avoid pitfalls. Second thing is, the big thing which has changed in politics since November, I think, is that the prism of politics has changed. And it's changed from being, as will always happen after a general election, a backward-looking thing. If the whole first year of the government, the only debate was how did this happen? Whose fault was it? Anytime I ever did an interview, the interview was only about, well, how much was Labour to blame for this in 2006? How much was it the world? Why don't you own up to this? Why don't you own up to that? In November, with the pre-budget report and growth flatlining and much bigger borrowing numbers, the prism of politics has changed. Because the question now, I think, is, and you see this in discussion in the media, is where the public are, is where's it going? Where will the jobs come from? Where will the growth come from? Will we be able to protect our pensions? What does this mean for the future? And that is where I, as an opposition politician, want to be. Doesn't mean that the question you ask about credibility isn't important. But the test for me now is, will people believe in a Labour alternative about the future? And so in a sense, that forward-looking frame is exactly where I want to go.
Question from John Davis, yeah?
Thank you.
This is a horrible question, but it's one that I ask myself.
Because the others will all be so easy.
Being Shadow Chancellor, is there a bit of you that hopes for recession?
Just say no, this
I can't break my rule of being honest. The answer is happening in the economy in a constituency like mine is really, really bad for young people and for family incomes and for people worrying about their jobs. And therefore, I couldn't have any self-respect and think, I wish it would get better. I wish it would be worse, I hope it doesn't get better. So absolutely not. And actually, how could you look at yourself in the mirror and be a human being if you thought that? Of course, there's a part of me which, I went out on a limb to say, this isn't going to work. And it's turned out not to work. And therefore, clearly, in a sort of professional sense, you think, well, at least I'm not completely crazy in my view of the world. So in that sense, there's an element of feeling, well, I didn't get that wrong. But actually, it would be stupid to say that there's any satisfaction in that. It's more it makes you think, well, actually, that the reading of the economy I had, and people like Bill had, and Danny Blanchflower, and actually the IMF, and many others about the economy, that's turned out to be, our sense of how economies work like this turned out to be more right than what I would call a discredited Treasury review of the 20s, which is we're now reliving again. So in that sense, intellectually, it's more, that's a bit reassuring. But no, there's no satisfaction in that outcome.
Can I add to that? Sam Britton, remember, he came into the distinguished Financial Times commentator, studied economics and came into it because what worried him was unemployment. And most of us who write about, they're worried about unemployment, and it gives you no satisfaction at all to write about something like that.
Sam Britton also told me something very important, which anybody who's ever going to do economic policy making should always remember. Sam Britton said to me on my first month in the Financial Times in 1990, he said, never ever trust in 1 month's figures. And always remember that every trend starts in the first month.
Very good. I'm being signalled from off stage. Just I've got 2 minutes. I have to say that I've got 2 minutes, or do I need to get on? But we'll take one question from the back there. There's somebody right at the very back.
Thank you. Women are the primary consumers of the welfare state, and the majority of public sector workers are women. And in the independent analysis of the current budget, it was estimated that 72% of budget cuts were coming out of the pockets of women. So how would you move the economy forward without leaving women behind?
Well, one of the most things I'm proud of in government was the way in which, with the minimum wage, we introduced a system of tax credits, which did huge amounts to support families and families with children. And because of the way the tax credits were paid, the children's element of tax credits going to women rather than men. And that's an aspect of what we did, which David Cameron, George Osborne, and David Laws and Nick Clegg have never been supportive of. And so that assault which we see on tax credits in the last year reflects that. And that is a substantial part of the reason why women have been hit so much harder than men in their pockets, because it's the same reason as families with children have been hit so much harder than families without children. And the Prime Minister said something again today which is incorrect. The Prime Minister says in Prime Minister's questions that a rise in personal allowance does more to help low-paid women, but it's untrue. The same amount of money spent on a rise in personal allowances versus tax credits over the same income range is adverse for women. A rise in personal allowances, which is the Liberal Democrat policy, will do more for men than for women in terms of the direct payment into their pockets. So I'm afraid the assault on tax credits and on the support for families with children is hitting women harder. And I think that's it's unfair and it's damaging. It's why child poverty is rising, and it's part of the reason why we've seen fall in confidence alongside fall in living standards. So I agree with you that I actually don't think it's possible to have an affordable modern welfare state in a global dynamic labour market unless you combine a minimum wage with building tax credits on top of that. I think there's any other way to do it. And we're facing a situation where that's being kind of withdrawn, and the consequence of that would be very dangerous for for the fairness of our society and for women's employment and also, I think, for the stability of our society as well.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm afraid I've got to wrap it up there. If you didn't get called, I'm sorry about that, but there may be a chance to buttonhole the Shadow Chancellor drinks afterwards in the octagon of the Queen's Building, which you'll be able to find a way to, I'm sure. The next Mile End group is with Stephen Hammond MP on the future of the City of London. So to the panel, thank you very much. And to those all in particular, thank you very much for